apartheid South Africa, where he couldn't vote because of the color of his skin, let alone run for office. He literally ran because that's what civic engagement looked like to him, knowing full well that he would lose. He conceded his election that night, and I learned what civic engagement really meant. A small postscript: a few years later, he ran again, and he won, making history by being the first of his kind to win such an office anywhere on this entire continent. But his subsequent victory wasn't as instructive to me as his initial loss. The night of that loss cut deep. This week, I felt the depth of that cut again. Tuesday was different from November 8th, 2016, the night Trump was first elected. That felt like an accident. This didn't. This time, there was so much on the line. Women are dying. The earth is burning. Wars are being waged. Democracy really is on the brink. I'm fairly certain this country will see some dark days ahead. But you know what I don't know? I don't know where we are in this effort to forge a stronger democracy and a more perfect union. Just as rebel colonists didn't know on April 19, 1775, when gunfire erupted in Concord, Massachusetts, or on September 3, 1783, when the Revolutionary War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. America had declared its independence from Great Britain 7 years earlier, a date we think of as the start of the nation. And yet on July 4th, 1776, this new nation was not even a quarter of the way through that war. America didn't know on April 11th, 1861, before the first shot was fired on Fort Sumter, how long that fight would take, or whether it would be much of a fight at all. Or on April 9th, 1865, after 750,000 Americans perished and Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, we still didn't know what the future of this country would hold. You can only know how these things end in hindsight, not while you're in the middle of it. Tuesday was not the end of anything, but things sure got dark. And here's the thing: history is steeped with examples of people who fought through the darkness in the glow of candlelight, people who knew, like my father taught me that night in 1981, that defeat paves the way for triumph. In fact, many who have fought in defense of human rights and freedom and liberty and democracy around the world did not themselves live long enough to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But the seeds were planted, and they flourished, in some cases after they were gone. Those people understood that the fight was bigger than they were. It was important to keep going, to nurture the seeds of democracy into a tree under whose canopy later generations will seek shelter and whose fruit later generations will eat. We do this. We fight not simply for ourselves, but for the future of democracy. Susan B. Anthony dedicated her life to social justice, particularly a woman's right to vote. For 45 years, she fought for women's suffrage with little obvious success. In 1869, just after the end of the Civil War, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution eliminated voting discrimination based on race, but not on gender. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, at least on paper. For many years, of course, the country largely ignored the 15th Amendment, manufacturing ways to suppress the black vote until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But nevertheless, the overt exclusion of women was a huge blow to Susan B. Anthony and to women across America. And yet, they persisted. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution was first proposed 8 years later, in 1878, and it would be another 42 years after that that white women would be able to vote freely. A freedom which is now the norm was for 50 years after the end of the Civil War considered a non-starter. During the Civil Rights Movement, countless individuals fought for years against segregation, from Rosa Parks to Ruby Bridges to Thurgood Marshall, the Little Rock Nine, the Freedom Riders, John Lewis, Dr. Martin Luther King. Black Americans endured decades of discrimination, ridicule, and violence, defeat after defeat along the way. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 99 years after the end of the Civil War, that segregation was officially outlawed in public places and Jim Crow laws were banned. Conflict often produces change, but change is slow, often not looking like change at all. In the case of this week, looking a whole lot like a setback. But today's setbacks are tomorrow's comebacks, and the comeback is our work. As my father taught me all those years ago, the fact that your side did not win is not a loss. It is simply a sign that your work is not yet done. And frankly, in 1775, in 1776, in 1783, in 1861, in 1865, in 1964, our work was not done. And it may never be done because democracy is dynamic and norms change, and we will confront issues in the future that we didn't know are issues today. And we will continue to fight. Now, I know that one of the toughest things to reconcile is the fact that half of America made a choice with which you inherently disagree. But maybe you found out that your neighbor, your friend, maybe your mom or your brother voted for the guy who wants to take your freedoms away. And that is a tough reality to come to terms with. As James Baldwin once said, quote, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist," end quote. Yes, votes were cast by people who would oppress and deny the humanity of some of us. But that fact is not true of all of the 73 million plus people who voted for Donald Trump. There are people out there, good people, who fell for his lies, but I believe do not wish to see pregnant women bleeding out in parking lots or the earth burn up or immigrants deported. And those are our fellow citizens with whom we must engage. There is neither time nor space for cynicism about politics today. The right to engage in politics is a privilege, one which my parents did not grow up with. It is a privilege we cannot give up and one of which we cannot tire. Cynicism about politics is a luxury of those who have never had to experience life without it. And if those people ever truly lost their ability to participate in the system, they'd never take it for granted again. This is going to be a challenge. The end of the tunnel is there, but it's too far away to see the light right now. So we will use flashlights until we get closer to the other side. We'll hold them for each other. But what you have, what we have, is agency, our voice. America chose a republic over a monarchy 248 years ago. We still have that republic. But Benjamin Franklin's admonition comes back to remind us time and again, we have a republic if we can keep it. And now, that is our work. Joining me now is the renowned presidential historian John Meacham. He serves as the Rogers Chair in American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, occasionally advises President Biden on historical matters and major speeches. He's also the award-winning author of numerous books, including And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, and His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. John, thank you for being with us to kick us off this morning.
Well, I think what you just did is more than a kickoff. That's a remarkable, both emotionally informed and historically informed essay that I think perfectly captures where we are. And the question is, I think, what now? And I am privileged that I don't have particular policy passions. And so my view of contemporary politics, unfolding politics, is that I want there to be an infrastructure of democracy, the rule of law, a constitutional arena in which we do what we're supposed to do, what folks who looked like me said we wanted to be back in the late 18th century. And then, as you so beautifully have detailed, it took so long to actually realize that promise. And that was a nation founded not on ethnicity, not on nationalism, but on patriotism, which is different. Patriotism is an allegiance to an idea. And the fundamental idea of the American experiment is that incredibly, that most important sentence written by Thomas Jefferson, that we're all created equal. And the truth of the matter is that, as you have pointed out, is that we have lived out of compliance with our own mission statement a hell of a lot more years than we've lived within compliance. There have been 59 presidential elections, competitive presidential elections in the United States of America. Only 15 have unfolded in a genuine multiracial democracy. And so this is an imperfect thing to begin with. And one of the things I try to say to friends who are on that edge of despair is history isn't necessarily comforting, but it should be inspirational, because fallen, frail, and fallible people like you and me managed to produce a country that was fairer, freer, and more just. And they weren't any better than we were, right? There was never a once upon a time in American history, and there's never going to be a happily ever after, because this is a human undertaking, right? There's not a magical moment. There's not a place where there is perfection within time and space. So what we have to do is bear witness, I believe, to that ideal, the ideal that we have what Lincoln called an equal open chance and an equal shot. And it's going to be really hard. It's always been really hard. And I think despair is a sin. And I think that the notion that it's just going to work out is wrong. But as you have pointed out, it would be breaking faith with the people who lived and bled and died.
Right.
It would be breaking faith with the folks at Lexington and Concord, with the people at Gettysburg, with the women of Seneca Falls, with the men who went to Normandy to free a continent. The men who went on Omaha Beach were there because of principles that are vital and animate this country today. And they are the principles that can't be abandoned because of a single election loss.
You wrote something that was published on Election Day in the New York Times. So you obviously wrote it before we had the outcome of the election. I just want to read a portion of it to our audience. America has always been shaped by the tension between hope and fear, justice and injustice, grace and rage. Whether the good prevails over the bad, whether we move closer to the promises of the Declaration or farther away from them, is contingent on the habits of heart and mind of a sufficient number of Americans in power and far from it. And that's what really stood out to me, that last piece of that, in power and far from it, because the people we're talking to this morning are people who think of themselves as far from power, even though really the most powerful person in America is not the president, it is the citizen with agency. What do you say to that person who feels far from power, who feels like they're on the outside of this thing right now and is losing hope?
I'm going to answer with a dated pop culture reference, which are the only kind I make. Remember the scene from Animal House, which came out about the time you had that remarkable exchange with your father, when John Belushi says, "Did we give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor?" You know, you can't give up, because what if John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boykin had decided not to cross the Pettus Bridge? What if the isolationists had finally and ultimately prevailed in the late 1930s and early 1940s? What if William Lloyd Garrison and his incredibly principled abolitionist movement, many of whom believed the Constitution of the United States in the pre-Civil War era was, as he put it, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and he wanted to move out of union with the slaveholders. And it was Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from enslavement, who had far more reason than any white abolitionist to want to